Hello, my name is Mark Hallett. I'm here at Stockholm at the 18th Congress of the Movement Disorder Society, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to interview Professor Günther Deuschl. He has been a past president of our society and has had a very distinguished career, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Günther, it's a pleasure for me to interview you. You and I have been friends for a long time. And I think it would be fun to start with your telling us how you got interested in medicine and neurology in the first place.
Well, actually, Mark, I have to say I didn't start with medicine after my school education. I started with mathematics mainly, and I was fond of mathematics because I thought that's the purest science that you can get. I was also doing some history, and so the years went by, and finally it was very clear that I will not stay in this field, because what was lacking were the humans, the humanities, and to have something to do with people, and that was my starting point. And then I started medicine in the 70s, in the early 70s. And after the basic education, which is 2 years in Germany, it was already clear for me that I have to go to neurology. That's the only discipline, because you know, thinking was very simple in these days. Choose an organ which is the most important one, then you make a few steps, and then you are at the brain. So it was from the very beginning. It just fascinated me, and then I went to basic neurophysiology and worked with Michael Illert, who was my teacher in these days. He was coming actually just from Sweden, working with Lundberg,
And so where were you then at that time?
That was in Munich. That was the whole time. Well, I was staying in Munich, and then I did a PhD thesis on anatomical questions. So I had a lot to do, not a lot, but I saw now and then Kuipers. He was in some way to me a person who had a great influence, because he was one of the geniuses in neuroanatomy. And I worked on the preganglionic nerve cells and did injections with horseradish peroxidase to label them, and that was more or less the first time that one knew the connections and the relations between ganglia and the spinal cord.
So Kuipers was working in Munich, or did he come to visit Munich?
Yeah, he came to I saw him on congresses. He came to visit Munich, and in these days he was really the person who was really a fantastic educator and a teacher in neuroanatomy.
Illert also was a very good person.
Yes. Illert is somebody who was really dedicated to teaching, and he was showing me everything, what to do and how to do it, and then we together developed methods to use this horseradish peroxidase, doing stainings, and analyzing the data in a way. I mean, in these days you made photographs. That was basically what you could do. So there were no computers to look at this, and I had to draw all my drawings myself in these days. Very nice.
Were there any people prior to Illert that got you interested in medicine or neurology? It often is people as well as the subject that are relevant in those decisions.
Well, you know, I mean, when I entered medical school, I was certainly very much interested in the basic sciences and I was just fond of physiology because physiology was the discipline that brought everything together. You needed anatomy, you needed biochemistry, and physiology made things going. And so that was the most fascinating thing for me.
So physiology and medicine, but then it became the brain because of Illert to some extent, I guess.
Yes, I mean, then Illert was in these days working mainly on the spinal cord. So he was in the Lundberg school, and he was looking at the propriospinal system, and that made me interested. And then there was another person in Munich, and that was Struppler, Albrecht Struppler, who was in these days the most important neurologist in Munich, and perhaps even in Germany in these days. And then I joined him after I finished medical school. I joined him for 2 years about, working with him, and he was doing stereotactic surgery. So he was doing lesioning in Parkinson's disease, mainly essential tremor.
Was he doing the neurosurgical procedures himself? I mean,
yes, he was
right,
one of
as a neurologist.
Yes, he was one of the few neurologists who had an OR. For the procedures, he always had an anesthesiologist coming with him, although they were done awake, but that somebody can take care of the patient while he was calculating the coordinates. I mean, in these days, functional neurosurgery didn't have a good standing. The people thought we should better not do it. You know, it was the time when psychosurgery was still discussed everywhere, and it was basically all functional neurosurgery was down. And Struppler was one of the few people who really did it. And what I learned there is that you can do, even with lesional surgery in patients which are carefully selected, you can do very well for a patient.
Now, Struppler was a pupil of Hasler, if I remember right, or was there some sort of relationship there?
Yeah, I mean that was a little bit late. Hasler was working in Freiburg. Hasler and Struppler, they know each other. They interacted a lot, but Hasler was living mainly in Freiburg, which was about 300 kilometers from Munich. And later he went to Frankfurt to take over a Max Planck Institute. But these two persons belong to the closest circle of movement disorders in these days, and they were heavily influencing everything in this field in Germany, which was after the Second World War relatively isolated. So they were not connected. In these days, nothing was connected very much as it is today, but they had a good relation among each other.
And again, because there's probably a lot of people do not remember Struppler. I mean, I do myself, but what would you say about his important contributions, and why was he so well known? And in the end, how should he be remembered?
I think he was just somebody who extraordinarily was interested in movement disorders. He was interested in physiology of movement disorders mainly, and he was interested in treatment of movement disorders. He has contributed a number of papers about rigidity, and he was among those who even did apomorphine in the very early days. He has some publications on this. I think that was his main contribution, and he was among those who rebuilt neurology in Germany after the Second World War. That was one of his main contributions, at least for my country.
And then I suppose his interest in tone got you interested in that area, because I know that's one of the areas that you started to do work in.
Well, at this point, you know, you were working in London in these days, looking at long latency reflexes, and I started doing that first with adequate means. With adequate stimuli, and then later with electrical stimuli, because that was easier to standardize. And this was probably the first time when we met and were discussing our common problems.
Right, right.
And there's a relation of these reflexes, particularly the long latency reflexes, with increased tone.
Right. No, it's interesting that the physiology in those days was of the spinal cord and basic reflexes, sort of, in a sense, following the Sharentonian type physiology, and gradually interest spread north into the brain.
Right, right. That's correct. I mean, you know, we were always talking about reflexes, and when the concept of a transcortical reflex emerged, that was really the first time when reflexologists became interested in the brain. That was David Marsden's contribution, and you contributed a lot to this, and my work was basically to transfer this into a clinical applicable tool.
Right, so why don't you talk a little bit more about your own work then, in terms of how it went from area to area, in,
well,
you know, in terms of your thinking about things and how it evolved.
Well, I was fascinated from the very beginning about tremor. This is just such a clear symptom. It is easily measurable. You can make all kinds of hypotheses, but you will have a hard time to confirm them. and that was always a challenge. We tried all kinds, and still do it until today, of understanding the signal. So that has a lot to do with mathematics, by the way. To understand the time series of tremor, which you can do in very different ways. And in these past days, we just looked at activation patterns of agonists and antagonists and things like this. We developed first concepts which could be assessed with different means. So it was, to some extent, it was a very exciting period. But then we recognized that all of this is nothing without having a broader concept of the kind of clinical forms of tremor that exist. And that was when we really tried for the first time to do this classification of tremors. All these tremors were in some way spread around, but there was no holistic view on this, and that was the first time. And now we are working on a second version for this, because it's certainly completely outdated what we did in '98. Right.
So let's go back, though, as we sort of left you in Munich, and you developed an interest in tremor while you were still there?
Yeah, that started there, but then I moved to Freiburg, where Karl Lücking was the head of the department, and he was particularly interested in movement disorders. He was also interested in lesional surgery, and he taught me a lot about just the phenomenology of tremor and Parkinson's disease. And he was an excellent clinician, and so I learned a lot from him. And the other person in Freiburg was Eduard Schenk. He was a colleague of Hasler, so he was to some extent a pupil of Hasler, and he had very close connections with Paul Hoffmann, the one who grandfathered the Hoffmann reflex, who detected the Hoffmann reflex, and he could tell stories about Hoffmann, who was a character, obviously. and has done all these nice discoveries, not only in reflexes but also in clinical. The Hoffman sign, for example, Hoffman-Tinel sign, is from him. That's what he did in the late First World War.
Hoffman worked in Freiburg? Or
Yes,
where?
he worked in Freiburg. He was the chair of the physiology department in Freiburg.
Okay, so there are interesting links. And then Jung was also
Yes,
there.
Jung was.
So how did that go? Yes, because he was a very important person as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So in these days, Freiburg was a very important place. Freiburg and Munich were and Hamburg were the three places where most of the neurological developments occurred, and particularly in Freiburg there was this physiology-oriented school, and Hasler was the one of the colleagues of Jung. Hasler was more interested towards functional neurosurgery, while Jung was more interested in clinical neurophysiology. Jung took over the neurology department there in Freiburg, while Hasler went to Frankfurt. But they worked together for a very long time. And by the way, I was sitting in Hasler's room for several years after he left. I was very proud about this.
Right, right. So the Freiburg school was a very important school. I heard, I think a rumor at one time used to be said that 40% of professors of neurology in Germany were trained by Jung.
Yes,
I heard that. I don't know whether
it's probably a little bit an overestimation, but that's true. There were important professors coming from Jung's school, and the interesting thing that were not only clinicians, that were also basic physiologists, which came out of the school. So that was really in these days when you did your clinical work during the day, and in the evening you went to the lab where a fellow has already prepared the experiment, the animal experiment, and then you did experiments until 12 o'clock at night. That was.
So were you doing animal experiments then too?
Well, they did it in these days in the department of neurology, in the basement. Nowadays, this is no longer possible, but in the 60s and 70s, this was how research was done.
Right, right. Okay. So you were working then a lot with tremor in Freiburg, and you were also developing the sort of clinical aspects of tremor, as you're saying.
That's exactly. That has had a lot to do with Carl Lücking and with Eduard Schenk. So we were collecting lots of cases with odd tremors. So we slowly understood that there's a variety of clinical signs of tremor. And then we tried to make up kind of a clinical classification of this, and this then we tried to look at the physiology of tremor. So that was all part of this period of my life.
Right, and then
I moved.
That was the next period.
Then I moved to you to work with you for about a year in Bethesda, and that was an exciting time when we had all these facilities which were not available in Freiburg. We had the PET scanning. We had all these colleagues around us, the ear, nose, and throat physicians, which we needed for the topic that we studied in these days, the palatal tremor, and we developed the concept of these two different forms of tremor. We had so many projects. I think from these years we had over time we had 16 publications together or so. So it was really a very busy time, and certainly it was. I was there with my family, and it was one of the easiest times of my life.
Yes, I think everybody who comes to NIH has a good time there. I think one of the reasons is not only because of the nice facilities there, but also you don't have a lot of administrative responsibilities, and you can just focus on research, and, that's a nice thing to do.
And I mean, there are mostly clinicians that come to you, and to no longer have the clinical load which all of these people have makes a big difference. So that's
right. Yes, well, we were certainly very pleased to have you there. You had come with a very clear project in mind with respect to palatal tremor.
Yes.
That was something that you had already worked on in the past, and you had some good physiological ideas, and so we were able to collect a number of patients and do some more studies in that regard. So just sort of thinking about that topic for a moment, because there's been some evolution in thinking about this all at the moment. Symptomatic palatal tremor we sort of understood at that time. Essential palatal tremor we didn't really understand completely, and now there's an evolution of thinking that maybe many of those cases are psychogenic in nature. What's your thinking about that now?
Well, it's hard to really make a good comment on this. You know, for most of the psychogenic tremors, we do have some physiology. We have a concept in mind, so we know that that co-contraction or even just voluntary movement with this entrainment sign, you cannot do two different rhythms in two hands, and all of this. This is evidence for a psychogenic origin of an extremity tremor. But when it comes to palatal tremor, we have nothing like this in our hands. We have only the observation that it can stop for some time, or it can be activated by what kind of mechanisms. And I mean, that is already known since 100 years. So that's nothing new. We just say, because it's like this, it must be psychogenic. But perhaps, I mean, I would just be reluctant to there are clear psychogenic tremors, but to say that the majority of them is psychogenic would go too far for me. I think when you have always a consistent clinical picture, which is sometimes associated with a behavior which reminds you to psychogenic disorders, that is by itself not a proof to me that it's psychogenic. So I would leave that a little bit open.
Yes. No, it's an interesting open question at the moment, which is a sort of a looking back at the work that we did at that time.
Yeah.
But then you went back to Germany.
Yes,
and carry on with your life story here.
Well, and when I went back, I started to apply for positions, which means in Germany that you try to get a position at to get the chair of a university department, and this finally worked very well in Kiel, and then this is different than in many other countries in the world. When you come to a department, you simply start working like a dog. You have to make concepts. You have to try to find the right collaborators. You have to look for the wards that you get good conditions for your patients, and the faculty expects you to succeed, and so the first years were very much simply building up, and it was clear it was my major project to develop a DBS center there. That was outspoken from the very first beginning, because I made I had to make the decision whether to go for stem cell research there and transplantation or for DBS. And then I choose DBS because I thought that this kind of treatment will flourish during the time I live. I was skeptical. I was skeptical whether both embryonic cells and stem cell would really make it to a point that you can apply it in patients. And so then a number of important persons came to my department. I hired Paul Kruk in the very beginning, and Paul then I asked him to go to Grenoble to learn all of this, because we needed somebody who was better grounded than I was in the field. I mean, I had all my experience with functional neurosurgery, which I did both in Munich as well as in Freiburg. We didn't talk about this, but there was Ostertag and Mundinger, and they did stereotactic lesional procedures, and I collaborated with them. But I wanted to have somebody who was trained in Grenoble, and Paul went there for a year. And then he came back, and then we started building up that. And then a few years later, he moved back to Grenoble because he was offered a very nice position there. And then Jens Volkmann came. And so over the years, we built up this scientific branch where we studied mechanisms of DBS. We looked at the effects of the treatment, and we tried to apply it not only to Parkinson's disease, but particularly to tremors and dystonia.
So let's go back to the very beginning. I think I was one of the very first visitors after you,
Absolutely.
after you moved to Kiel.
After 3 weeks.
And as I remember, I think Illert was there.
Yes, Illert was there.
I mean, so that's an interesting
Yes,
tie.
that was a reunion. So
yes.
I left Illert when he stayed in Munich, and then I left him when I went to Freiburg. But then we worked together again in Kiel.
Right. I remember going there. Your neurology department was so young that when I came there to give a talk, I gave it in the physiology department.
Yes,
if I remember.
yes, that's right. That's right.
Yes.
That was. I mean, the department in these days was in a building that was built in 1901. So very traditional, so to say. And Creutzfeldt, actually, the Creutzfeldt, Jakob Creutzfeldt, he was one of the heads of the department in these days, still neurology and psychiatry, during the World War and after the World War, World War II. And then after almost 10 years, in early 2000s, they built a new department for us, and since then we are together with neurosurgery and neuroradiology, which certainly was a big improvement in our just in our facilities.
Right. So what other things would you like to emphasize about your department? It has been a highly successful department.
Well, it's a nice place, first of all. Kiel is at the Baltic Sea. Nobody knows it, and it's not a very large town. As many German university cities, it's a town with roughly 300,000 inhabitants. University is clearly the most important employer in the city. The university has a long tradition. There are about 3 or 4 Nobel Prize winners coming from Kiel, and it has never been a university like, for example, the Charité or the Humboldt University in Berlin, or it was always a medium-sized university, but it has a very nice culture. So if you're there as a neurologist, you know a priest or an historian, or you can make connections with the technical faculty. So that's a university of very close interactions, which you can also see in our grant applications. And the neurology department was very welcome to join this group, and I really took advantage of the possibilities that are given there. And we built up these close correlations with the Department of Neurosurgery. Maximilian Medon is the head of the neurosurgery department, and with whom I have certainly a very, very close connection. So we really, he was the one who really developed this for Kiel, and who developed this, and we had over the years, a very close connection. And then there was the psychology department. We had young people coming, which developed their career in Kiel. So it was just fun, and it was an interesting group to work with.
And and at some point you sort of organized a lot of the DBS throughout Germany. How did that come about? Because that's been a highly successful collaboration.
Yeah. That was something which, for some reason, in Germany, people understood that we can only succeed on an international level if we organize ourselves, and if we make a group of researchers nationwide, and we started a collaboration which is called a working group for deep brain stimulation. We met each other every half year about, and had a close connection within the so-called basal ganglia club. And out of this we developed a group that made some applications for the German Research Council, and we were successful in getting grant money. And that's how we started. Meanwhile, I mean, there was the first Parkinson study in 2006, the stimulation for dystonia, which Kupsch was the first author, and Jens Volkmann the last author. And then we had early stim, and then we had now the next thing will be torticollis and many other indications where we simply tried with a relatively straightforward protocol to understand what DBS can do for these patients. And that was really done collaboratively. Very nice.
Now, another aspect of your career has been involvement with organizations, and
Yes.
maybe we'll start with the Movement Disorder Society, since we're at a Movement Disorder Society meeting. How did you first get involved with the Movement Disorder Society, and tell us how you progressed through the ranks to be president and so on?
Well, I mean, I think everything started in Lausanne. That was the first ISMD meeting. We met there, and I remember that we were sitting on a boat on the Genève River, on the Genève Sea Lake, and we were talking about all kinds of movement disorder problems. So that was the first time, and it was very clear in these days. David Marston and Stan Phan were to some extent, for all of us, they were teachers. We were happy to see them. The congresses were small. We had close contacts with them, and so the whole group educated each other to some extent.
That's true, yeah.
And so that was how I get. And then the movement disorder was founded, and from the very beginning, it was my society. It was scientifically, I was always at home in this society, and so I think I was among the IC in '94, and then later I had the privilege to edit Movement Disorders together with Chris Goetz, and that was probably the finest time of my life, scientifically spoken, because it is so nice to see all these careful scientific work coming up, and and making wise decisions on what to do with the manuscript. It was also a very nice time with Chris, with whom I collaborated very closely. And later on, somebody asked me whether I want to run for president of the society, and then I was president in 2009 to 11, I think. No, 11 to 13 it was. Yeah, yeah. Which was also a challenging time. I mean, the society is now a mature society. We have established extremely successful congresses. We have educational activities which are really worldwide. I mean, it's just fantastic to see that growth.
But you've been involved with other societies as well. So I guess what you learned from the Movement Disorder Society, you have expanded in other areas.
Yes, I try to cross connect to some extent. So I was also asked sometimes 2005 to get the president of the German Society of Neurology, which is a pretty large, one of the largest neurological societies in the world. It was in these days. It was just at the point where they turned into a more professional organization. So I had the pleasure, together with a very close colleague, Otto Busse, who was who was running the head office, but he was much more. He's a trained neurologist, and he led a large neurology department. And we together brought the German Society to Berlin, and that was a nice time. And then we had the 100th anniversary in 2007 of the German Society for Neurology, where by chance you got the Erbmedaille, which is
for which I'm very grateful.
Which is the highest honor that the German Society has. Well, I mean, it's really like this, that learning from the Movement Disorder Society helped me to do my job for the German Society better, and vice versa. Because I know very well the difference between an international society now and a national society, which is a big difference. And you have all these involvement in politics, which is not so important for us in the Movement Disorder Society, but at the national level it is.
And then you've gotten even involved now with the new EAN.
That came out of the blue. So the European Academy of Neurology was founded by very wise people who said it must be an end to having two European neurological societies. And they were the heroes in this, and they really made this possible. Detlef Kömpf was among them, Gunhild Waldemar, and many others, De Ruyck and Monen. They were the ones who finally managed to bring this together. This is very recently, and then they looked for a president, and there were 3 candidates. It was just recently, and then I've been elected at this point, because I think it's really a challenge, and I would really like to see the European Neurological Society to become a member of the big societies in the world, and this is what we are aiming at.
Right, so that's a very good goal for the future. So you have a lot more work that you have to do. So we've talked about your life scientifically, but I know you're a great family man. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, very briefly.
briefly, yeah, sure, that's all right.
The most important person in my life is my wife. I met her when we were pretty young, so 21 or 20, and we spent the rest of the life together since now. And she was making all these important decisions together with me in my life, and we have two sons. They are now both physicians and have their own life. One is a cardiologist and the other is getting a neuroradiologist. We meet them all the time, as often as we can. And we spend time together either by fishing or by going to the opera or by going for skiing. And it's just fun seeing this next generation coming up. And now there's already the over next generation, so I have my first grandchild, which is a great pleasure. Well, that's briefly what my private life is.
But I know it's very important. Yes, are there any hints about how you can balance family life and professional life? That's always a difficulty for many people.
I have often thought about this, but this is probably a weak point of our generation. Probably you are the same. We have worked very hard, and the family life was present, certainly, but the real managers of the family lives were probably our wives, and we were, I would not say guests, but we didn't have a role in the family that how it is today. The young generation very much more takes care for this, which is probably very good. And so the work-life balance is clearly in our generation probably a weak point. Although I must say, I mean, I have always spent holidays with my family, and I was not, I mean, in the times when we had no computers, I was not only reading and writing, so there were always family activities each weekend, but I came home late and I went out early, so it is a little bit different from how it is now.
So what sort of advice would you give the young people coming up through the ranks now, particularly perhaps the young people of the Movement Disorder Society who are neurologists or other people interested in the area of movement disorders? How should they build their careers? What are the exciting things for them to consider doing in terms of their own careers and moving forward?
Well, I think looking for something that has relevance to the therapy of our patients is probably the most important part. I had this twice. I was one of those who developed botulinum toxin and one of those who developed DBS. The other thing is that I think don't focus too much. I mean, it's good if you know something about imaging, if you know something about clinical assessment, if you know something about rating scales, and if you know something about basic neuroscience. And I think for a clinician it's very important to have a sound education in basic sciences, any field of basic sciences, but then broaden the view and really use all of the new technologies that we have now. My dream is that at some point we can unify to some extent the molecular sciences which have now are now very important with the systems neurosciences which we need to understand our diseases. And that is not yet at this point. And looking for topics at this crossroad is probably where you can do most for the patients in the future. That's what I personally believe.
Right. So you have obviously more to your career to go, but in relation to things that you've done, what would you consider to be your most important contributions to the field. That's a difficult one for someone like you who've made so many.
No. I mean, just picking out in terms of papers that I've personally written, it's probably the work on palatal tremor. It's probably the classification of tremors. It's the two big DBS studies. I think that are the areas for which I think that is something which was a contribution.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that we've had a very nice conversation with Professor Günther Deuschl. He's been very kind and shared a lot of his past history with us and told us about how his life has been and learned about movement disorders. I'm sure that he will be accomplishing much more in the future, so perhaps we should have another interview sometime again. But in the meantime, it has been a great pleasure for me to interview you. We've had a lot of fun, and I hope other people enjoyed listening to this as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark.